you missed the time when you picked up the wisdom document of the Testament of Solomon, which is like a medical dictionary, and it's fun. It's such fun to read. Wisdom said, you've got to name the demon. When you've named the demon, you've got control over it, and then you administer the herb that will cure your sore throat. Isn't that brilliant?
Is that how they went on?
Yes, yes.
Of the time.
Yes. I mean, they had no medical dictionaries, but that was the best they could do, which was a mixture of old traditions and angels and demons and wisdom. Anyway, if you missed that, that's just fun to read. You can always take them.
Hello.
How are you?
Oh, right, fine. We've been away for over a month, so I'm just when Sandra said it was on today, I said, well, no, Shaz, 30th of July, actually, it is 30th of July, so there you go, that's a state honey.
Let me see what I've got that will cover what you missed.
July.
I wrote this last week. Well, whatever.
Do you think you might do that afterwards? It's only because we're now live and people will be settling down for the lecture. Is that all right? Could you pick up the bits afterwards? Yes?
Sit on one of the new chairs.
Is that all right? I'll just set you going.
Warm bottom chairs.
HMS Sultan. HMS Sultan, apparently.
Oh, right.
Or on loan to them or something until we get
Feel free to start whenever you like.
Peter's trying to park the car. He said, I'll drop you out, you can save me a seat. Overcrowded. Oh, good afternoon, everybody. Good to see you and to all our other visitors via the media. Today we come to what I think is one of the most interesting sessions when the Old Testament, which we're still in, begins to overlap with the New Testament. But we're staying firmly in the Old Testament camp. Anyway, let's get started. King Herod the Great died in the year 4 BC. And this was the beginning of the end of the state of Judea, and after less than a century after the Jews had become part of the Roman Empire, with very many favourable terms respecting their unique religion, they had managed to keep their own rulers, remember, providing they caused no trouble and always obeyed the Romans. We must remember that it is as impossible to think of the Jews as one united group as it is to think about Christians in all our many diversities. In Judea, the central hub which united all but two of the various Jewish groups was the one and only temple. It was ruled by the high priest and all the Sadducees. The Pharisees were mainly middle-class people, law-keeping Jews. The rabbis taught the ordinary folk in the synagogues and offered health cures from the Testament of Solomon. And if you missed taking a copy of these when we were doing the wisdom literature, I've put some more copies on the table. Help yourself today. Ordinary people also favoured tales of the apocalyptic angels, demons, and the Son of Man, promising God's imminent intervention in their lives, like John the Baptist. Then there were also the Essenes and the Qumran communities who'd abandoned the temple altogether. Not to mention the worldly, rather non-religious Jews, the Zealots, who, like their name, had only one ambition, and that was to get rid of the Romans forever. Herod's reign had been a prolonged time of peace and plenty for the Jews. But he had reigned like a typical Greek autocrat and invited many such people to live in the new cities he had built, to the chagrin of the Sadducees, who were unable to prevent the arrival of so many non-Jewish immigrants. This had been a two-way activity, as the Roman Empire had grown, and many more Jews than ever before had emigrated and settled in the cities all around the Mediterranean. They became known as the diaspora, the dispersion. They spoke Greek, they traded prolifically, but kept their own unique religion in the midst of the variety of cultures around them. They read their scriptures in Greek. Remember the Septuagint translation made in Alexandria? But they became noted for isolating themselves from society, particularly at the dinner table, because of their dietary laws, which made it almost impossible for other people to invite them to dinner. But not only that, there was the Sabbath day activities, different from anyone else in the empire. And gradually, the more serious-minded people, often well-educated Gentiles, found Jewish monotheism much to their liking. They joined the Jews in their synagogue worship on a Sabbath day, and they became known as the God-fearers. Some of them even became full Jews by circumcision and baptism, promising to keep all the precepts of the Torah. The most famous of these synagogues were at Alexandria, Antioch in Syria, Damascus, Cyprus, Corinth, Ephesus, and we mustn't forget Tarsus. Jews in the diaspora, however, couldn't live in isolation. They became aware of the many religions that abounded in the empire around them. And I'm going to list some of them. There was the overwhelming Roman state religion, which prevailed everywhere, demanding loyalty to the emperor, whoever you were, wherever you were. And that loyalty exemplified in burning incense to his statue as if he were a god. The Jews, though, had that valuable exemption which Julius Caesar had provided for them. Then there were the national religions with their fertility cults or their cosmic star gods. Then there were the Gnostic sects. You haven't heard of these before, but they were societies in an educated world who professed to know the secrets of true knowledge. Wow. But these secrets, of course, were only divulged to those who'd been through severe initiation ceremonies, rather like the Masonic movement in our days. And then there were the several mystery religions, and each one was based on a myth of the dying, rising God. Do you remember the old Baal religion? That was one of them. Baal had killed and was raised to life again. Of the fertility cults going through winter and in rebirth in spring. So that's the basis on which they were all made. So these myths of the dying and rising God existed all over the Mediterranean. And they included the Osiris cult in Egypt, the Greek and Roman gods of the Dionysus or Bacchus, the god of wine, and the Demeter Persephone cult, rejoicing in the cereal crops each year. And this cult led eventually to the religion of Orpheus with his music. Well, we shall meet several of these when we meet St. Paul on his travels, only half a century after the death of Herod. After 4 BC, Judea was divided into 3 jurisdictions under Herod's 3 remaining sons. Do you remember them from last time? There was Archelaus on the left, he took over Judea. Herod Antipas took over Galilee. And on the right, Philip, who inherited all the lands on the other side of the River Jordan. Now, Archelaus supervised his father's splendid funeral. It really was a magnificent event from all accounts. And that was at the city of Herodion, that city inside the top of the hill. And he promised to rule well. So all sounded well, until he found he couldn't. Almost immediately he had a revolt on his hands from those who wanted to punish his father's advisors who'd heard the very cruel deaths of Judas and Matthias just before he died. Do you remember? They had torn down the Roman eagles from over the gateway of the temple. Archelaus suppressed this rebellion and then set off to Rome to receive his tetrarchy from the Caesar Augustus, only to be followed by a Jewish delegation to the emperor saying they were not willing to have him. And while they all argued in Rome, Augustus sent a procurator named Sabinus to take charge of Herod's fortune. You grab the money if you can. And then to organize Judea's finances for the future. Sabinus, though, was so harsh with the Jews that more riots broke out. So seriously that the legate in Syria, named Varus, had to come to Jerusalem with lots more Roman soldiers to deal with it all. The war of Varus was nothing more short of a cruel, ruthless massacre of brave, unorganized Jews, in which at least 2,000 were crucified, including 3 very popular leaders of the various revolt groups. There was Judas of Sepphoris, whose father had been killed years before when Herod had been governor of Galilee. There was a shepherd called Athronges, and a freed slave, Simon, all of whom people had hoped would be that God-sent Messiah they were hoping for. Augustus in Rome ignored the Jewish delegation, but reduced Archelaus' title to Esnarch. He returned to Jerusalem with less than he'd hoped for, and became very unpopular when he continued the oppression that Varus had started. Judea was simmering with discontent, even more so when Archelaus increased their taxes, knowing full well that they couldn't pay, since the slump that had followed the collapse of Herod's building works had led them into poverty. His cruelty now, however, kept them quiet for the time being. There was no religious leadership, as Archelaus had hired and fired several new high priests in quick succession. And finally, in the year 6, in the 1st century CE, after Christ, a deputation went to Augustus, who summoned Archelaus to Rome and banished him to obscurity in Vienna. The last we hear of him. Judea then became a Roman province that ruled directly from Rome by a procurator, whose administrative centre was to be in Caesarea on the coast. In that same year, Augustus sent Quirinius, a familiar name, but not for the right reason. He was the governor of Syria, and he was sent by Augustus to conduct a census. So far, okay? No, in Judea, not Galilee. It's Luke's story that puts the census in Galilee, not Judea. Augustus sent Quirinius, the governor of Syria, to conduct a census of Judea. And all this was discovered in 1850 by a German scholar called Schurer. So I'm only repeating what the scholars have found out. Well, Quirinius reorganized the exchequer and appointed Annas and his family to be the new high priest of the temple. There we are. There he is, a venerable gentleman. And then he returned to Syria, leaving Judea in the hands of the procurator Coponius. The census, however, and there's a copy of it, inflamed a huge Jewish rebellion led by the Pharisees, during which another yet might have been Messiah, Judas the Galilean, was killed along with many others. And during this time, of course, or by this time, a 10-year-old Jesus would have been aware of what was going on. Judea now settled down. Augustus died, and the new emperor was Tiberius. And then a new apocalyptic prophet became the new wonder, especially in Judea. He proclaimed that God's Messiah was imminent, and he would initiate the kingdom of God. And this prophet's name was John. Famous for baptisms. John appeared out of nowhere, out of the desert where he lived as a hermit. Now, there's no record of his call from God, only Luke's birth story, written many years later to subordinate him to Jesus. Please note we're dealing with history here, not gospel. John's call to the Jews was one of repentance, as in the style of an 8th century prophet. Without an apocalyptic thought in his mind, he proclaimed, like the prophets of old, that the day of the Lord, judgment and vengeance, was imminent, describing it with images of harvesting, sifting, and burning of chaff. He was obviously well learned, and the Pharisees approved of him. There's no record, apart from Luke's story, that he was born into a priestly family, and there's no hint that he'd rejected the temple like the Essenes or the Qumran community, whose teachings he espoused, though with differences. For example, the Essene monks wore white. John didn't. He's reported wearing rough clothing of camel's hair. John was a vegetarian, unlike the folks at Qumran. But rather like them, he did baptize. The Jewish historian Josephus wrote of John that he worked with ordinary people who went out to meet him, where he taught them, and I quote from Josephus, to practice virtue and righteousness towards each other, and to act with piety towards God, and thereafter to come for immersion, for the purification of the body when the soul had been cleaned already by righteousness. And I'm quoting from his book, The Antiquities, chapter 18. John's baptism, like the Essenes, was the culmination of a 2 or 3 year discipleship. But unlike the Essenes, it did not induct them into a new community. After baptism, John sent his disciples back home to prepare the people there by repentance for the coming of God's Messiah, whoever that might turn out to be. Josephus also wrote, and when the others, meaning the Jews, gathered together, because they were excited to the highest degree by hearing his teaching, Herod Antipas feared that such persuasiveness over the people might lead to some sort of conflict, for they looked as if they would do everything by his advice, and he thought it much better to get rid of John, so as not to regret getting into complicated affairs. Therefore, on account of the suspicion of Herod, that's Herod Antipas of Galilee, John was sent to Machaerus, and there he was killed. End of quote. Well, it's the Gospels, actually, who give us the dramatic story of his death, which could indeed be quite authentic, but we have no verification of it. there are no Jewish records of John's teaching. Machaerus, that terrible fortress. If you ever go to the Kingdom of Jordan on your travels, you'll be taken to the top of there, where an Arab will appear. Would you like a cup of tea? Absolutely priceless. But anyway, Machaerus on top of that huge mountain in the eastern part of the Dead Sea, where John the Baptist met his death. Well, no records of John's teaching. If there were any, they were lost during the final civil war, which started later that century. Some of his disciples had transferred their allegiance to Jesus, who had himself been one of John's disciples. And no doubt Jesus' ethical teaching, recorded in the Synoptic Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke, together with his radical approach to the law, may well have been inspired by John. Some of John's disciples went to their homes in the diaspora, and some years later, Paul met some of them in Ephesus under the leadership of Apollos, but they hadn't even then heard of Jesus. Herod Antipas survived in Galilee because there were no violent uprisings after John's death, even though Galilee, his jurisdiction, was a hotbed for rebellion. Herod Antipas was allowed to breathe a sigh of relief, but not for long, because Jesus came on the scene. By this time, Judea was under the control of the procurator, very familiar name, Pontius Pilate. He became procurator in 26 and served for 10 years till 36. He was a stupid Roman, according to Josephus, who deliberately set out to provoke the Jews. He installed more Roman eagles in several places from Caesarea to Jerusalem, and then was astonished at Jewish reactions. He sent his soldiers out into the volatile crowds with clubs hidden under their cloaks, with permission to use them any time to wound or kill any objectors at will. Well, trouble could break out at any time, anywhere, just as Jesus began to heal and teach in Galilee. Well, this approach to the life of Jesus will be as historical as we can tell from the records of Josephus. With the help of sympathetic Jewish scholars today, such as Chaim Maccabee, who's working in the University of Sheffield, because although the Gospels give us valuable insights to the teaching of Jesus, they reflect a very different style of literature. It would seem that Jesus was probably born in Nazareth, in spite of Luke's beautifully crafted birth story to link his family roots back to King David. Nazareth was a small town in Galilee, near to the newly built Greek city of Sepphoris, and it is possible that Joseph the carpenter had worked there on its construction, and even possible that the young Jesus growing up helped as well. But Jesus would have received his initial education in the synagogue school at Nazareth. Do you remember? I showed you that time. It's a reconstruction of the synagogue from the remains that they have found by the archaeologists. So he received his early education in the synagogue school at Nazareth, and from his later quotations, it would seem that he'd learnt the Psalms off by heart, and also Deuteronomy, the book of the law, and the prophetic scroll of Isaiah. They were the most quoted that he ever made during the story of the Gospels. Well, if Luke's story is historically correct, then Jesus met the Pharisaical schools in Jerusalem when he was an emerging teenager. But apart from all that speculation, Jesus was unknown until he was 30 years old, when he'd been baptized by John at the end of his 3-year discipleship. The baptism of Jesus was a theophany experience for him. Do you remember we talked about theophany experiences with Moses, and Samuel and various people in the Old Testament? And after it, Jesus' life was never the same again. Unlike his fellow disciples of John, Jesus did not go home. He didn't go home to preach that the hope for Messiah was imminent. Instead, he knew deep inside himself that he was called by God to be that Messiah. It's emotionally true that he needed to go away by himself for a while to come to terms with his new realization and ponder on how best to proceed. The delightful but personal stories of this time out in the wilderness alone could only have come from Jesus himself, a superb storyteller. Himself examining the many paths forward. And with the help of the scriptures he had learned in the synagogue school, he rejected 3 of the most popular possibilities to meet people's hopes and expectations. He rejected the temptations to win support for his position as a miraculous feeder. No more poverty, no more hunger. Wonderful for everybody. He rejected also to be a spectacular wonder worker, throwing himself off the temple and surviving. But even most importantly, he rejected the idea of becoming a military leader of the people against the Romans. He first returned to Galilee, and with the help of some of John's disciples who joined him, he made the base of his mission in Capernaum to start with, on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, where fishing was one of its main activities. It would seem so, though, in close reading of the 4th Gospel, and thanks to others of John's disciples who lived in Jerusalem, Jesus visited there often enough to have established good friendships and a lasting ministry there too. Just for the thing, how many friends did he have who put him up for the night without a word of worry about it or questioning? And for the future, in this course, I will explore this possibility with the help of the unidentified beloved disciple of the 4th Gospel. And we only know him by the nickname which Jesus gave him, as he gave nicknames to so many of his disciples that we only know this one by his nickname, beloved disciple. But anyway, that's for the future. Well, Jesus began his ministry as a healer of people's ailments, whether they were physical, mental, emotional, or religious, or spiritual. And he soon gained enthusiastic supporters who were eager to spend time with him and even follow him from place to place as their lifestyles made possible. And eventually, he created his own traditional group of 12 permanent disciples who would commit their lives and futures to him, learning for themselves how to visit the unknown places and talk about Jesus and his mission, and later to learn his teaching off by heart for future reference. In his teaching, Jesus proved to be very articulate, with a great gift for poetic interpretation of Israel's wisdom, and a sensitive perception which enabled him to confront individuals with their own personal crises with comments like, "Let him without sin cast the first stone." Well, tradition demonstrated an unusual intellectual understanding of the law in Jesus. His thinking was original and unconventional, especially in his abandonment of many of those cleanliness laws. But his morality was firmly traditional. But all this left the Pharisees, his natural supporters, feeling somewhat bewildered. They didn't know how to take him. But he was also a brilliant storyteller, able to communicate his teaching to all sorts of people at the same time. He enjoyed invitations to dine out when invited, again, bewildering John's former disciples, who no doubt expected him to espouse a life of austerity, and at the same time ensured quiet times for himself and for his disciples to connect with the will of God in prayer. The fourth gospel records a similar pattern of ministry in Jerusalem, where many there hoped that Jesus would be accepted as the political Messiah and become the leader of a movement to re-establish Jerusalem as the city of David, with a temple at its heart. And at some time unknown to anyone, it would seem that the members of Jesus' family moved to Jerusalem in the expectation that this would be their future too. The royalty connection was established, as Hiram Maccabee has pointed out to me, that when the time came and Jesus was no more, the person who inherited for him was not Peter, it was his brother, James, the brother of the Lord. That's a royal idea of succession within the family. So, Jesus made his move one Passover time and entered Jerusalem not on an ass, not on a war horse, acclaimed by an excited crowd who sang their Passover songs with enthusiasm. Jesus made for and entered the temple and established his reason for being there when he overthrew the money tables of roguish traders, and declaring that the temple should be a house of prayer. He stayed with longtime friends at Bethany that week, going back to the temple each day, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, no doubt hoping that the high priest would invite him to a meeting. But day after day, no such invitation came. Instead, it seems that the priestly community looked on Jesus with suspicion and fear that he might provoke an uprising of the people against Rome at the volatile time of the Passover festival with its emphasis on Jewish freedom. They decided that the safest solution would be to get rid of him. Pilate, who had no wish to please the Jews, for once cooperated with them, being at that time rather worried for his own reputation in Rome. So Jesus was eventually killed on a cross. But Pilate had the last word. He insisted that the condemnation of Jesus was written above his cross, "The King of the Jews," in 3 different languages, so that no one could avoid it. Thus ends the story of Jesus. And his story would have got lost, leaving his name only to be remembered in the list of would-have-been messiahs. His disciples melted away, like John's had done after his death. But the atmosphere in Jerusalem calmed down again. Pilate didn't survive much longer. He was recalled to Rome in 36 and lived the rest of his life in obscurity. Please note, we cannot consider the resurrection of Jesus in an historical story. It's a mystery beyond the historical scope of time and space. Therefore, we can't do it. The effect it had on the followers of Jesus, however, is indeed the historical beginning of yet another story. So we don't miss out, but we stick to history, and we can't cope with anything other than the end of Jesus, with his death. Well, the followers of Jesus did not melt away for very long. They began to tell from their own experience that God had raised him from the dead, thus proving he was indeed God's Messiah for the Jews. And from then on, a new community came into being with a very spiritual but real conviction. And it soon became known as the Followers of the Way, the original title of this little group. They were also called later the Nazarenes, long before they became known as Christians. They were known originally as the followers of the way and was led by the rejuvenated and ebullient disciples who from then on became known as the apostles, the people with good news to take through the post, a gospel to tell. Well, a few years later, the Emperor Caligula came to the throne. He had exalted ideas of himself. He was only a young man. He had these exalted ideas. He claimed to be a god. And he decided he was going to transform the temple at Jerusalem into a temple to himself, with a huge statue of himself erected in pride of place. Well, this immediately set alarm bells ringing in the memories of Jews, memories of Antiochus IV, 200 years before Caligula. Would there be a new rebellion? But no. While the statue was being carved in Syria for safety, and before it could be dispatched to Jerusalem, Caligula was assassinated, aged 29, having been a disastrous emperor for only 4 years. Danger for the Jews was averted for a few more years, but I'm afraid the worst was yet to come next Sunday at 4:30 here. Thank you for coming. See you all next week, hopefully. Bye.
Many thanks indeed, Barbara.